All right, well, welcome. Thank you all for watching our video. We're really excited about this collaboration and our symposium, which is titled Working During the Global Pandemic, Unique Challenges and Ways of Coping for Women. And so I'll let everyone introduce themselves before we get started with presentations.
Hello, my name is Dr. Margot Greger. I am a visiting assistant professor at the University of Akron. Excited to be here.
I'm Janelle Wolf, and I am a fourth-year doctoral student at the University of Akron in the Counseling Psychology program.
All right, and I am Nuha Al-Shabani. I am a fifth-year student at the University of Akron Counseling Psychology program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Richman. I'm professor of psychology at Muhlenberg College. I'm also a licensed and practicing psychologist.
And I am also going to introduce Dr. Avantika Bhatia, who's a assistant professor at Ashoka University, who had to record her presentation because of time change differences and not being able to find a super easy time. And so Avantika is going to go ahead and give her recorded presentation that Janelle's going to show.
All right.
Hello, everyone. I'm Avantika Bhatia. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Ashoka University in India. I'm excited to present the findings on data we collected from therapists in India last year. This presentation is titled Professional Quality of Life and Psychological Well-Being of Indian Female Therapists During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Aradhita Gupta, Kriti Jain, and Sudarshana Gupta have worked with me on this particular study. Okay, so what led us to study the experiences of therapists? Well, along with the threat to physical health and well-being, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is recognized to contribute to significant impairment in mental health functioning. In fact, a recent global survey by the WHO indicated that the pandemic is increasing the demand for mental health services. And we also know in this past year, mental health concerns seem to have been triggered and in some cases exacerbated by loss of loved ones, loss of income, increased isolation fear, and several other consequences that have been part of the pandemic. So therapists then find themselves in the front lines of managing these mental health concerns while also tending to the implications of the pandemic in their own lives. These demands become even more salient when we think about low to middle income countries like India, where resources to mental health remain severely limited. A few studies in the last year also highlight the impact of the pandemic on women specifically, and it appears likely that the psychological effects of COVID are further compounded for women. And thus, within this context, we believed it was important to study the experiences of women therapists in India who were conducting clinical work during the pandemic. We looked to study experiences of female therapists in two domains. One was their professional quality of life, and the second was personal well-being. So in terms of professional quality of life, we utilized DAMS model to examine therapist reports of compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. This model is widely used among helping professions as a way of understanding the positive and negative consequences of helping work. Compassion satisfaction can be thought of as the positive consequence of one's work, including things such as the work-related satisfaction that one derives from helping. And on the other hand, compassion fatigue captures the negative consequences of helping work. Along with the consequences on therapist sort of quality of life, of work on therapist quality of life, we were also interested in examining personal well-being. So for the purpose of this present study, we attempted to look at the health-related and especially mental health-related quality of life or well-being of therapists. We believe that this would make the most sense, sort of given that the study was being conducted during an ongoing pandemic. Let's look at the variables we focused on in this particular study. So I do want to add that there are a number of studies on the correlates of therapists' quality of life and well-being, but no study to date has examined these variables in a sample of Indian therapists. And in addition to our knowledge, there's limited to no data on how a therapist's professional quality of life or work-related quality of life is associated with therapists' sort of personal well-being during the pandemic. So that's something that we wanted to assess here. We incorporated the following set of variables in our study. This was based on theoretical models, past literature, and we also included some unique COVID-related variables. So you can see we divided our variables into 3 clusters. The first included therapist demographics. In the second, we looked at variables that we thought were specific to the COVID context. I'll come to these in a little while when I describe the measures of our study. And finally, in this third cluster, we included therapist perceptions of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is defined as the positive psychological change experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. We hope to understand how this kind of growth would bear upon therapists' quality of life. We also know from past literature that women tend to report more growth than men. So we were interested in seeing how that sort of plays out in our sample here. And finally, results from a few studies have indicated that clinicians tend to experience growth through their work with trauma-related concerns. So we were interested in looking at post-traumatic growth in our sample, as they were both, focusing on trauma that perhaps the clients bring in, but also the crisis that might have been occurring in their own lives as a result of the pandemic. Here's a brief pictorial representation of our study aims. So we wanted to look at the association amongst our variables in these 3 clusters on compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. We also wanted to look at the associations among therapist demographics, COVID-related variables, and post-traumatic growth with well-being. And then finally, we also wanted to see how compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction would predict well-being. So we plan to do this through a regression analysis. In terms of the method of our study, we utilized an online survey. Eligibility criteria included the therapists had to be at the postmaster's level. They needed to be conducting clinical work in India. They had to be over the age of 18 and proficient in English. We recruited participants online through listservs and social media. Data was collected between August 2020 and October 2020. Our study utilized a cross-sectional design. Here is some information about our participants. The data that I'll be presenting here is based on 147 female therapists practicing in India. You can see the mean age is 34. This was a national sample with the majority of participants indicating that they were living in Bangalore, Mumbai, and Delhi. You can see the distribution of religious backgrounds here as reported by the participants. The majority were Hindu. In terms of socioeconomic status, most folks identified their socioeconomic status as upper middle or middle, and relationship status, most identified being married or in a domestic partnership, followed by single, never married, in a relationship, divorced, separated, and then widowed. Here are the measures that we utilize in the study. I'm going to run past this just in the interest of time. These were standardized measures that we use for post-traumatic growth, for professional quality of life, and well-being. As I mentioned earlier, we also added a few single items that we felt were specific to the COVID context. The first 2 you can see get at sort of how connected the therapist was feeling to their personal relationships and to their professional relationships. And we did this because we wanted to understand the sense of connection given sort of the social distancing, physical distancing, and lockdown conditions that have been happening globally and also in India. We also asked therapists to indicate to what extent they experienced the pandemic as a major crisis in their lives, and to what extent they believe that their clients were experiencing the pandemic as a major crisis in their lives. Here is some more information about our sample. Most of our sample was indicated that they were at the postmaster's level. That is reported a range of years of clinical experience, a range in terms of the number of clients that they were currently seeing. You can see the ST values here. They also appear to be following heterogeneous theoretical orientations. Here are the results. So only 1 therapist in our present sample reported being diagnosed with COVID-19, so we couldn't do any analysis with diagnosis and the other variables in our study. Almost half of the therapists in our sample indicated a score greater than 50 on experiencing the pandemic as a major crisis in their life. This is on a scale of 1 to 100. And most of our sample indicated a score greater than 50 on believing that their clients are experiencing the pandemic as a major crisis in their lives. So most therapists here believe that they were working with clients who were experiencing a major crisis at present. If we look at levels of compassion fatigue, compassion satisfaction, and post-traumatic growth, we find that for compassion fatigue, the mean value in our sample was 23. This lies close to the cutoff of 20 for the 50th percentile. And for compassion satisfaction, the mean value is 37.5. This lies close to the cutoff of 30 for the 75th percentile, indicating that these levels of compassion satisfaction were higher in our sample. Post-traumatic growth, the mean value was 2.07. A mean score of 3 indicates moderate level of post-traumatic growth. So when we filtered the cases further, we found that 21.8% of the therapists in our sample indicated a score greater than 3 on the post-traumatic growth scale. Here are the associations. I'm just going to highlight a few. Again, I won't be able to walk through all of them, but I'll highlight a few that I want to discuss and point out in our key findings. So the first thing here is the age and number of years providing therapy. You can see that both of these relate positively to well-being. Next, connection with personal relationships and professional relationships. You can see that these relate positively to compassion satisfaction and well-being, and then negatively to compassion fatigue. So we felt that this was important and really talked to sort of the salience of feeling connected when it comes to being associated with professional quality of life and well-being. We also found that post-traumatic growth related positively to compassion satisfaction, but this was a small effect size and at the 0.05 level. As mentioned earlier, we also conducted a regression analysis where we looked at well-being as the outcome variable. In our first model, or the first step, we added age and number of years of providing therapy because we wanted to control for these. And then we looked at professional quality of life, where we looked at compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. We found that this model was significant, so it contributed to 44% of the variance in well-being. And we also found that compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue individually related to well-being, right? And I'll explain sort of what this means in terms of the takeaways here. Okay, so let me come to our discussion and talk about sort of our key findings. Okay, so first is looking at the levels of compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction in our sample. It appears that in line with previous literature, our sample of female therapists are experiencing both the negative as well as the positive consequences of therapeutic work. Now, of course, you want to understand what contributes to these factors. We want to make sure that we do try and focus on enhancing compassion satisfaction, maybe reducing levels of compassion fatigue. So one thing that really stood out from our data is the extent to which female therapists were feeling connected to their personal and professional networks. So an implication of this could be really paying attention to these connections and finding ways to build on these connections while therapeutic work is happening during this time. We also saw that in a model where we controlled for age and years of clinical experience, both compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue predicted well-being. And this again maybe points to the importance of looking at both the positive as well as the negative consequences of helping work, because it does bear upon how one is sort of feeling overall in terms of their health and mental health. I want to add a quick word here about post-traumatic growth. Even though we found that it related to compassion satisfaction with a small effect size, we do plan to do further analysis. We're especially interested in looking at the role of post-traumatic growth as a moderator in predicting compassion satisfaction. So we're excited to sort of see what the data yields with that. And then I'll come to sort of my limitations. Of course, the study has limitations as any other. The first is that we utilize only therapist ratings, so we are restricted by the mono method design of the study. Although we offered a predictor outcome sort of model using regression, I want to mention that this is a cross-sectional design, so we're really limited in the causal inferences we can draw. I do think it will be interesting to track these levels of compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction and see the changes that makes in well-being in longitudinal designs in the future. We utilize single item measures of questions that we thought were relevant again to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we need this area sort of warrants further attention. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation. You can see my email is listed here. I'd be thrilled to hear from you if you have any questions, comments. I can also say the practicing female therapist. I've really enjoyed presenting these findings, and I hope you can find something to take away. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think, am I going next, right? Okay. I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. Okay. Alrighty. So hello, again, Dr. Margot Greger at the University of Akron, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the qualitative experiences of academic women in STEM. What do they need during COVID-19? And this was a research project that was done in collaboration between the University of Akron and St. Elizabeth University with my collaborators, Devin, Marianne, Anthony, Javier, and Simone. So this may come as no surprise to folks who may be watching this presentation, but when we think about sort of the representation of women in STEM, both sort of at the kind of job level as well as in academia, we find that women are particularly underrepresented in STEM professions and in academia, particularly racial and ethnic minority women. And we know from very early research during the COVID-19 pandemic that there's been a disproportionate impact on academic women for a multitude of reasons, but a lot of research is indicating that, you know, in terms of sort of the family and childcare responsibilities, that sort of the working from home part of the COVID-19 pandemic has really hit women in terms of sort of the ability to be productive, or that there's shared responsibilities at home. We find that mothers with young children in dual career partnerships have experienced a reduction in their work hours up to 5-fold when compared to fathers. There's also been some research really looking at sort of productivity, at research productivity, at even things like tweeting and sort of social media engagement. We're finding that women are sort of being hit disproportionately compared to their male colleagues. And we know that that's in combination with a multitude of pre-COVID barriers that women experience in pursuit of academic careers within STEM. So we know that workplace policies, unsupportive work-life balance environments, sexism, and informal exclusion in the workplace often are things that impact women's progression in STEM academia. And so part of the question that we were curious in answering as part of this research study was, how might the pandemic be exacerbating these pre-existing barriers at an institutional, departmental, and individual level? So the aim of the present study was to investigate useful supports, either workplace supports or personal support, for academic women in STEM positions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this research was informed by social cognitive career theory, as well as the psychology of working theory. So to tell you a little bit about data collection and analysis, this study, the question that we're answering today as part of this presentation was part of a larger study that was looking at a sample of STEM women and the larger impact of COVID-19 on their tenure journey. And so the question that we asked women particular to this research was, what supports would be useful during this time, either through the university or from other sources, to cope with the effects of COVID-19? And this data was coded using consensual qualitative research modified, CQRM, which was selected because it allows for a large number of participants with brief responses. And I think this is particularly relevant and important because, you know, COVID-19 and the role that it has had in sort of the impact on women, well, across the workforce in general, I think is largely, you know, a new topic that we really don't have a lot of experience with. And when we're trying to kind of answer questions where there's not a lot of research literature that's, you know, pre-existing, then we're really trying to work from the ground up. And I think that this type of data analysis really allows for there to be an exploration of what is coming out of the data, especially when there's not much to sort of, you know, hypothesize from that data, or to really think about what might be there pre kind of looking at the data. So in terms of our participants, they were 34 female identifying untenured women in academic STEM positions. The average age of participants was 35, mostly white, non-Hispanic, heterosexual, married with children. And most of these women reported working in the Midwest, mostly faculty at public and private doctoral level research institutions, and had high research productivity expectations. Represented a diverse range of STEM disciplines. And again, these were folks that were untenured, so in the first 5 years of their appointment in academia. So data analysis was conducted of a coding team of 2 individuals, myself included, which were 2 white, cisgender, heterosexual female early career professionals in counseling psychology. Very importantly, we identified potential biases surrounding the results that we expected from this study as part of sort of our bracketing experience. And the coding procedure was that I reviewed the first 20 participants and developed an initial list of domains and categories based off of what I saw in the data. And then my coder then went and sort of reviewed that initial list. And then we came to consensus about that preliminary coding structure and then proceeded to code the data in chunks. And then modification of the domains and categories were adjusted through the consensus process between her and I. The result of that was 3 domains: work supports, personal supports, and global supports. And you'll see here that the majority of the results that we found were related to work supports. So when we looked at what women were really talking about when we asked them what was needed, the primary sort of responses that we've got were around workplace environmental things that they were asking for. So you can see here that increased resources for faculty and staff, adjusted tenure criteria and expectations, increased and effective communication, administration or academia in general, acknowledgement of pandemic's impact on productivity, increased resources for graduate students, a focus on essential activities, workplace policy changes, and increased connections from colleagues or mentors. I'm really only going to focus on the top ones that came out here. And so those were increased resources for faculty, staff, adjusted tenure criteria, increased and effective communication, and acknowledgement of the reduced productivity due to the pandemic. So here are some sample quotes that highlight these different categories. The first one here: I'm running out of money on my startup used to pay my staff, and I would really appreciate a refund of that money so that I can continue to pay my staff to collect the data after the pandemic that they should have collected during the pandemic. And this was representative of a couple different folks that talked about sort of the concerns related to money that they had procured for their research that then was going to run out as part of the pandemic, and then really trying to scramble to figure out how they would pay staff and graduate students as part of increased resources that faculty needed as part of the pandemic. Tenure criteria. The university heavily suggested that faculty to consider delaying their tenure clocks, which was stressful for me. Instead of giving us credit for working during challenging times and potentially adjusting tenure criteria, they instead reminded us all that we should be constantly worried of not measuring up at tenure evaluation time. This was also sort of mentioned by other folks in the sample that talked a lot about the feeling that although many institutions implemented tenure clock stops or extensions of tenure time, that this was actually not what they were looking for, that was helpful, but that what it was doing was sort of keeping the expectations the same, just adding an additional year rather than adjusting the expectations for tenure with the context of COVID-19 being part of that criteria, which was frustrating for a number of folks. Effective or really any communication from my department. So increased communication from all levels at the institution. And lastly, if someone at the upper levels of my department or university could send an email saying, we know this is tough, we know this is hard, we know that you are struggling, we're not expecting you to be doing amazing right now, we're here for you, we're here for you. And many folks talked about this as sort of an acknowledgement that you know, that the pandemic was having this large effect on folks across the board. And really, again, I think it kind of ties in parallel to reducing expectations around tenure as well, as sort of this idea of, listen, we don't expect you to be living up to sort of this expectation of productivity or things that maybe we had held in the past, that there was some kind of understanding or acknowledgement that things had changed drastically as a result of COVID-19. And I think also, not just from their institutions, but from academia in general. I saw other participants talk about things like, you know, no, now is not the time to be writing grants. Thank you very much. So again, sort of an acknowledgement that COVID-19 had lasting impacts on the kind of tenure experience for women. So when we think about personal and global supports, we saw childcare, a desire to be closer to people, and sort of general personal or global supports that came up. Some examples here, at least part-time childcare would make life much easier and maybe reduce some anxiety. What would help? Not living alone, having physical contact to people. More nationwide infrastructure to support vulnerable populations. And what was interesting when we looked at sort of these responses was that women often qualified these responses by saying that they didn't think that these things were feasible in the current moment, either because of safety considerations or that it just wasn't possible to be around loved ones that were far away, or again, because of you know, risk of safety, but that these were things that they were really missing or wishing that they could have in their lives. So when we think about sort of, you know, implications for higher education during the time of COVID-19, is that I think first and foremost, we really need to reevaluate tenure expectations and criteria in STEM and possibly other fields during this time of crisis to promote equity. I think related to what I was saying previously, it's sort of like we've kept the bar the same given all of the increased obstacles. And we're just saying, oh, okay, we'll take some extra time, as opposed to sort of readjusting what we're expecting from women during this time, especially when we know that there's sort of this disproportionate impact that COVID-19 is having on the productivity of women compared to perhaps their male colleagues. Additionally, we understand that acknowledgement is critical. You know, for me personally, in reading these responses, I think the thing that struck me the most was really that the desire for people to just sort of have some human empathy during this experience and to really be compassionate to the experiences that these participants were having, right, from their workplace, from the people around them. And what we understand is that that acknowledgement is really, really important, but that also it's not enough, because women also talked about other needed resources, including social support, financial support or grants, support for their students, check-ins with faculty, mental health and wellness, and letting the non-essentials go. We didn't talk much about that, but a lot of folks talked about the reduction of administrative or service-related tasks and activities, because they felt like, you know, at this point, is that really the most essential thing that we should be focusing on during this national crisis? So again, sort of acknowledgement, really important, but not enough. I think lastly is the importance of communication, really a need for clear communication in a streamlined and organized manner. A lot of folks talked about communication as happening, but sort of, you know, that there were multiple emails that were hard to take, you know, kind of to keep up with, or that communication was good at the beginning, but then kind of stopped or slowed down. So kind of this constant need for effective and clear communication from their institutions. When we think about clinical implications, you know, again, there's a current mental health crisis in the United States, and this is likely affecting STEM faculty as well. So for those of us clinicians who may be working with clients during this time, I think it's important to be aware of the myriad of institutional and systemic barriers that might be impacting women's work lives as well as their personal lives, and then kind of the ripple effect in their mental health and social support and functioning. And I think when we think about too, for those clients, as well as for those of us in academia who have colleagues in STEM, you know, it's sort of encouraging clients and how can we encourage for advocacy around kind of institutional policies for these folks to be able to get peer and personal supports to ask for specific resources. In terms of limitations, the data was collected early in the COVID-19 pandemic in April, for about 2 or 3 weeks in April of 2020. And so what's likely is that the research, you know, in terms of what resources are needed, needs to continue to happen because, you know, COVID-19 is likely going to have these ripple effects, and especially for faculty in STEM academia, where their research is really based a lot on experimental lab conditions, where a lot of folks have talked about sort of how entire years worth of lab work of colonies of mice or other experimental you know, animal populations have all been decimated, and how long that's really going to take to build back up. And so even when institutions start to reopen and things start to go back to whatever normal is going to look like, I think there really needs to be an acknowledgement and continued research on the resources that these folks are going to need continuing forward to sort of rebound from these effects of COVID-19. I think also a limitation of our study was that it was a mostly white straight sample. This limits the conclusions that we can draw about the needs of other women of color or minority identified faculty. And I think it's really important in this time to also continue to have research amplify these voices and really look at the unique experiences of women who are in sort of a marginalized employment field, but also with you know, their kind of unique constellation of identities and how that might be impacting either the barriers or the needed supports that they might need in academia. So that concludes this study. Thank you for listening. I am happy to answer questions, or if you have comments about this research or would like more information, feel free to contact me at the email address provided here. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I will start sharing.
Okay, so I'm actually going to just leave my screen unmuted because I'm going between like 2 different laptops and don't want to be distracting. But so our presentation is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on vocational well-being of women in counseling psychology. And we have one of our quotes on this first slide from our participant that talks about, you know, women are strong, they're tough, they're independent, they're good at all these things. And then that creates this expectation that you're always going to be good at these things, which is just not sustainable, especially during, you know, this pandemic and other difficult times that folks go through. And so just a introduction. So as we've heard from all the presenters so far, women are experiencing a lot of these secondary impacts from the pandemic, such as, you know, a majority of frontline healthcare workers are women. And so they're experiencing, you know, upfront the health concerns, or don't have the luxury maybe for working from home in those positions, and the job sectors that are most affected by the pandemic, such as retail or food service, other kinds of hospitality services are often more populated by women and people of color. And so those are the jobs that are, you know, more lost during this time. And then even with all of these additional, you know, responsibilities at work or job loss, or, you know, dealing with your own experience for this pandemic, women are still continuing to also bear the majority of household responsibilities, including childcare, which has been, you know, increased in time and effort and energy into things like helping children with, you know, online classes and things of that nature. And so for many women, these responsibilities have actually increased during the pandemic, both at home and at work. And this can result in a lot of role stress, especially when you're trying to do, work-related activities and household activities all, at home within maybe the same hour, and feeling, guilt from not being able to, as participants will talk about, split between household childcare things and work things all the time. And so just to highlight some of the job loss. So women have lost about 1 million more jobs than men during the pandemic. And in the month of December, all of the job loss was specifically among women workers. And when you kind of dig into these statistics, a big part of why we're seeing more women kind of losing their jobs is because they are having to choose between childcare and helping their children with school all day, or going to work. And so a lot of the job loss is also related to this added layer of being responsible for the household. And like we said on the previous slide, just certain sectors are being affected more that tend to have women.
So the theory that we're using is socialist feminism. And this basically states that there is a connection between capitalism and money and gender oppression. And this connection shows up in a lot of different ways. For example, one is the pink tax, which describes how products designed for women cost more than those same products for men. And it also shows up in roles for the home. So men tend to be defined as workers and in the public sphere, and women as caregivers in the private sphere. So for decades, women's roles have been defined in this private sphere where, they're providing free labor, they're doing childcare, a lot of household responsibilities, and men's roles are more defined in the public sphere where they're getting paid for their work. So as women's roles started expanding and women were able to go out into the public sphere and, be working, making money, they were still expected to come home and take care of their responsibilities in the domestic sphere. So this is called the second shift. This is the theory that provides this foundation for better understanding these additional difficulties that women are facing for having to manage all of these things at home in addition to working out in the public sphere. And as Nuhan mentioned earlier, this attempting to balance this and all of these social roles can cause a lot of role strain. So the COVID-19 pandemic has created an additional and unique strains on women's ability to balance their work and personal responsibilities, especially given that many schools and childcare facilities are closing during the pandemic. Women's workload has increased, and for many, this is at the expense of their professional work and vocational well-being. For example, in academia, for women in academia, childhood and other increasing household responsibilities have resulted in a lot less time for research, publication, and grant applications. Some journals have reported that submissions from male authors have increased during this pandemic. So we're really seeing this results in more privileged colleagues being able to move ahead of those who are being more affected by the pandemic.
Yeah, and as we also heard from Dr. Greger, there's a lack of research exploring how women are affected by the pandemic, especially in the workplace. And so we wanted to add to that literature and kind of build that understanding, and then also to capture the experience of those who are also navigating that while, having young children at home. And so we wanted to explore this specifically for women in counseling psychology and the strain that they kind of feel on their vocational well-being. And so we wanted to really just highlight the inequalities or some of the stressors that women had, previously faced and then might be exacerbated by the pandemic, and how the current pandemic might even be creating new challenges for women as they navigate their vocational well-being during this time. And so here are overarching research questions. So what is the lived experience of work-life balance for women in counseling psychology during the COVID-19 pandemic? How do women describe their experiences of role strain? And how do women in counseling psychology believe the pandemic might impact their vocational well-being? And so we wanted to take a phenomenological approach, again, because there isn't a lot of research on this topic. We wanted to, start from the ground up, hear what this is like for people's, true experience or the essence of this experience, and kind of capture what is the shared meaning among women in counseling psychology who are kind of working and balancing childcare and household responsibilities, and really kind of give them voice to express what is this like for them. And so we had participants who self-identified as women in counseling psychology, had been employed full-time, and had at least one child under the age of 12.
Okay, so in terms of our participants, data collection is ongoing. So far, we have 6 participants. 2 were graduate students in counseling psychology programs. 2 were professors. One professor is tenured and the other one is tenure track. And then we had 2 practitioners. In terms of race and ethnicity, the majority were white. We had 4 white women, 1 Middle Eastern North African woman, and 1 Latina mestizo woman. And they were all aged 29 to 39. In terms of sexual orientation, one of the women had a partner who was also a woman, and the other 5 were in heterosexual couples. All of the interviews were taking place in the past couple of months, so in December and January of 2020 and 2021. So we're going to go through some of the major themes that we found. When we put up quotes, all of these names are pseudonyms that were chosen by our participants. So we're really seeing this theme. One thing that came up was this adapting over time. So participants described this process of adapting as reactive or survival based, especially when the pandemic first hit. So really not having time to, make a lot of intentional decisions and just kind of do what they can. And as a result, having a lot less time to process the effects of the pandemic. But over time, we saw that our participants were talking about phases. So going from survival to then thinking more about coping and coping skills within the system, and then now kind of being in this stage of rethinking what's working, what's not, how are we going to kind of adapt. So the quote we have here is, we are kind of piecing things together for a month. And then our son went to daycare for like 10 days, and then his daycare shuts down. And then we were home trying to work. And so, yeah, we actually split childcare from March until June. And then we ended up hiring a nanny to come help out a bit in the summer. In the summer, I could take on more childcare responsibilities, but I was teaching in the summer too. So we hired somebody to come in our house, and they've been working as our nanny since June. Another thing that came up a lot was this sense of intentionality. So really, it really highlighted that these women were talking about intentionality being needed before the pandemic and just navigating these different roles and making time to do everything. And that really kicked up during the pandemic. So in some ways, the skills they were already using from the past, they had to really kind of kick up to manage the pandemic and work-life balance. So we saw this in communicating with their partners and planning intimate time with partners. Like a lot of participants talked about planning specific date nights and quality time, splitting time with children, and sharing housework. All of it seemed to be very systematic. So one of our participants said, this is an orchestrated theater, kind of like every day, everything happens at the time that it's supposed to. And just really having this set schedule for commitments. We also heard a lot of people talking about having these certain pockets of time. So like one participant talked about how, okay, my kid is at daycare, and for these 2 hours in between clients, this is when I work on my dissertation. But then also needing to be flexible because things change and they have to adapt. So another quote talks about a lot of language talking about partners kind of stepping up with support during this time, and says, and now he's done a really good job of like working out the schedule where he'll do dishes one night, then I'll do bath, then we'll switch the very next night. And it's just been really nice. So I think in that way, he's recognized how difficult it really is and has stepped up a lot.
Yeah, so another theme that came out was really boundary setting and having to redefine how these boundaries are, within the romantic partner relationship, with family members, with colleagues, and with, their children. And so this looked like, reorganizing the physical space at home, creating, workspaces at home, and kind of telling children that they, as you see in this quote over here, can't come into this room when, mom is on the phone, for example. And so creating those physical boundaries and then communicating them with people in the household. And then trying to create boundaries with in-laws was a struggle that many of our participants had, especially in terms of in-laws and other family members wanting to interact with their children. And then at the same time, when, childcare facilities were closed down or, not feeling comfortable utilizing childcare facilities, figuring out how to create boundaries on who might be helping to care for children and who might not be, and how to communicate that to everyone so that people don't feel, upset or that someone else is getting to see their grandchildren when they're not. And so having to constantly, revisit these boundaries as the pandemic has moved on. So I won't read this quote directly just for time, but we can go to the next one. And so when we looked at vocational well-being, many of the women felt that they were still having meaningful work. They felt that, in their clinical work, they were contributing to this larger sense. As we saw in that first presentation, many practitioners feel like their clients are going through a global crisis right now. And we saw that as well with the people we interviewed. And so feeling like it's really important to provide these therapy services during this time. And then when we talked about, well-being, many of our participants felt that they had been supported by their institution, and they thought that they were getting supportive emails, that people were kind of understanding that maybe you don't get your clinical notes in time, or that maybe, when you are teaching online for the first time, it's not going to be your best performance. And so really feeling like that was communicated from staff and colleagues and supervisor. Some folks were given, certain time off to kind of recuperate and figure out, how do I shift all of my services or classes online? And many people talked about how they felt like their entire department or their entire staff was all stepping up and doing extra work. And then some institutions did relax tenure requirements. And so something that surprised us was that many people actually did identify some of the benefits that had come out from the pandemic in terms of their work-life balance and vocational well-being. And many of this benefits were kind of around the idea of being able to do things remotely, being able to come home at an earlier time. And so you get to have dinner with your children. And in the past, when you were on campus for late meetings or late classes, feeling like, you missed out on those moments with family, or not having to drive, pretty far for just a meeting and coming home. And so many of our participants really liked the flexibility that has come about with this virtual work life. So they can, take a child to a doctor's appointment if needed, things like that. And many of our participants are hoping that these changes continue when the pandemic is over, so that they can still have more kind of work-life balance and enjoy these moments or responsibilities at the home. And having also continued increase of empathy. Participants talked about how, now that everyone's dealing with this struggle of being home and trying to navigate work at home, they can understand even more what that would be like if you also had a child that you were caring for. And that sense of empathy has been really refreshing and rewarding for the people we interviewed.
Yeah, so some of those coping skills and benefits. And then on the flip side, there was also some themes of isolation and loneliness and lack of connection, especially in the winter. Participants said it was difficult because they had planned to do like walks with their friends and family members. It seemed like some of the participants who were in academia, or the two that we had, were still involved with their colleagues through like committees and faculty meetings. but also that our participants spoke about being the ones who were responsible in their relationship for the social component. So that kind of dropped out when they had to balance all of these other things. So we're just seeing it's difficult to coordinate that in the pandemic in general and with these new demands. A lot of participants talked about the like not getting those interactions down the hallway and those kind of casual things that you didn't have to plan for intentionally. Another theme that we saw was guilt. We talked about how guilt doesn't really go away, it just kind of takes new forms, whereas previously there was guilt around working and not being at home. Now it's about being home but not being with the kids or cooking, or feeling like guilt around screen time for kids, even though that tends to be the only time when our participants could do something for themselves or get things done. So the guilt doesn't go away, it just kind of changes shape. And then we also saw, especially in academia, a lack of time for research. And this was seen as really the only commitment to drop. So other commitments seemed binding and were things that had deadlines and were requirements of their positions. So it seemed kind of for a lot of our participants like the obvious thing to drop, and how they said, you know, it's more important to be there for a student than to go out and do research, but we recognize that a lot of that might be due to socialization for women, and that one of our people in academia had already had tenure, so there's less of that requirement to go out and get published. We also saw this division of labor dynamic in the faculty, so kind of mimicking that same private and public sphere, where the women faculty are responsible for taking care of the students in that private sphere, and the male colleagues are out publishing and getting recognized in the public sphere.
Yeah, and so when we asked women, is there additional support that you might need, even though they felt that there had been an increased understanding in their experience, they were still feeling like there could be more understanding from folks. So people might have more empathy, but maybe they weren't actually changing, the workload. And so turning that empathy into, an understanding that has actionable components to it, like relaxing rules or deadlines or expectations of quality. The most prominent issue had been childcare, and so finding more ways to support women in that, but then doing so in a way that feels safe, especially during this, experience of needing social distance, and just having some future hope that people are flexible in their expectations of these women in their workplace. And then so some of our discussion points is that, this really highlighted that even before the pandemic, our participants were experiencing a lot of these challenges. And now that people are at home and kind of able to view that, they have maybe a little bit more empathy, but there still needs to be some actionable changes in turning that empathy into something that works for everybody in terms of like workplace requirements. And then that there can be some potential benefits if we continue to use some of the flexibility with, virtual meetings and things of that nature. And then one of the things that came out a lot, as Janelle was saying with the isolation, is that there's less options for coping and connecting, which, as we saw from the previous two studies, are really important. And then some of our major limitations is that, our sample was pretty heterogeneous in terms of everyone was partnered. Most of the women were white. Most of the women were in heterosexual relationships. And so this might not be generalizable to all of the women in counseling psychology. And that our, interviews were taken at the end of 2020. So some of our, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So some of our implications is just this potential to inform policies that hopefully would create a more equitable work environment that protects vulnerable workers, such as working mothers. So examples like guidelines and extensions and flexible deadlines. Also, results can help members of the population understand these common stressors and this consciousness raising of knowing that they're not the only ones related to this role strain and trying to manage work in in the public and private spheres. And lastly, to inform, help therapists like work with working moms and understand the types of barriers that they face and help with kind of coping with that. Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for your fantastic presentations. I mean, it is certainly timely and raises the stakes a little bit in terms of what we are all facing right now. So I guess one of the things that really struck me about all the presentations was how much validation or awareness is just not enough. And so I wonder what your individual thoughts are about what we as psychologists can do in order to improve the current conditions for women, particularly as it relates to work and mental health.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that, one of the things that comes up is like a support was like coping and relationships. And so I think that psychologists can be integral in trying to facilitate some of that and teaching people how to maybe continue building relationships or how to connect in this virtual space. As well as I think, with this research and these findings, we have data that shows like, institutional changes need to be made. And so that can be put into like briefs or written into op-eds, things that are easily read by the public and presented to folks who can make those changes.
Yeah, I think being able to communicate the data and having, I think a lot of policymakers want to see like the data that supports it. So I think being able to go there and say like, here is our data, here's what we need, and try to inform policy that way.
Yeah, I think my answer is similar in terms of advocacy efforts. I think just a communication and a presentation of data and needs, and to not kind of go quietly into sort of the status quo and to continue to have sort of these negative effects be sort of silenced, I think is an important contribution that psychologists make. I think as well as supporting clients who are suffering with this. I think we're experiencing a national mental health pandemic as well. And additionally to that, I think a lot of clinician burnout as a result of this. And so I think there's many places where, on one hand, I think it's good that folks are getting support, but I think also it's sort of paying attention to sort of the mental health needs that are arising as part of, kind of these consequences of COVID-19 as well.
Yeah, and I just also wanted to add, I think that stories are so powerful, and we had 2 qualitative pieces today, and just like, I think that's a unique contribution of psychologists, is that we can get these stories from people and share them, and that not only validates the people who are already experiencing that, but I think can also be really impactful in changing people's minds when they think about, oh, if I, give people time off, what's that going to do? Well, if you read someone's quote, you can see exactly what that might do for them.
Many of the conclusions that you all drew at the end was that institutions need to change, and in some ways there is a pressure and expectation from participants to see institutions change. But given what we know about how institutions function, that seems to be putting a lot of power and agency on the very places that probably will not prioritize women. So what is the role of building solidarity among women as a way to elevate voices and to demand change? One of the things that worry me is that if our conclusions continue to come back to, well, we need those in leadership to change, how realistic is that?
I think that's a great question. And I had actually talked about that with one of our participants, like this idea that like women are doing so much and they're so hard and they're so tough and they're, also not asking for help is kind of like a barrier in creating solidarity. And so I think part of that is like having these conversations with each other and like modeling and being genuine with what's happening for you and how you're handling it, which I think is another unique contribution of psychologists and feminist psychologists. And so I think allowing for some of this consciousness raising to happen amongst ourselves and being like, oh, this isn't just me, or, why am I having these unrealistic expectations of myself, can create more solidarity.
I think it's also sort of about holding some accountability and asking why these things are not changing, and not, again, sort of accepting the status quo as the end all be all, and sort of holding institutions, like when I think about sort of tenure changes, right? And sort of, can we make a policy change around tenure expectations for the folks that are in the process of promotion and tenure for these women? And it's in, when we think about sort of, how hard would it be for institutions to change or make exceptions or make some kind of, small kind of adjustments to the tenure criteria based off of COVID-19, like that's really not a hard thing to do. It does not impact the financials of the university. It's not like that's gonna, have some sweeping implication for students or staff or anything like that. It's really just supporting these folks who are really going through hell right now. And I think that when we think about sort of those demands, it's like, that's not a hard thing to accomplish. Like, so I think that there's also sort of this accountability that we need to hold folks in upper administration too. And I think about too that it always brings such an interesting point of like, we need more women in points of leadership and points of sort of power and authority in order for there to be sort of, not that that's the only way that changes should be made, obviously, because our male colleagues should also care about the well-being of women on campus, but that I think that it also speaks to sort of this need for there to be voices within authority and power positions that help to kind of advocate and to do some of that consciousness raising, I think, as well. And sorry, I'm a little stuffy. My nose is, I'm sick, so I sound a little congested anyway.
I guess my last and final question has to do with the samples presented today. So it looks like all the research really reflected professional women, women with high levels of education, and for the most part, with few exceptions, primarily white women. So, I mean, can you speak to what you see as the challenges of understanding women's experiences who are not represented today, and what recommendations you might make moving forward so that we as psychologists have a sort of clear picture of the landscape?
I think anecdotally, one thing that came up is that a lot of people didn't have the time or resources to even participate in our study. And so we got a lot of feedback of like, this is a great study. I can't commit an hour of my day to this. And one of our participants had been talking about, I think one of the things that makes this doable for me is my like economic status right now. And so I think that even to participate in research, you have to have like a privilege to be able to take an hour out of your day. And so, like when we were thinking, like we have all people who are partnered, like if we wanted to get single mothers, that would be really hard because when are they going to commit an hour to us? And an hour is just for the interview. You have to like plan it out, do the emails, do all these things. And so I don't know how to address that issue. I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was thinking back to like our like socialist feminism, and like we're not paying women to take the time to do these things. And so like if we pay women, then we're compensating them for taking the time to talk about their experiences. So that could be a way. I think also even like being able to put this presentation together midway through our data collection allowed Nuha and I to take a step back and be like, whoa, 4 out of our 6 participants are white. Like we have to more intentionally recruit more diverse samples as we finish this data collection.
Yeah, and maybe we need to also rethink our methodologies. Instead of doing 1-hour interviews, maybe, 10-minute interviews over different time periods. I think, time is critical right now. So I really want to applaud this important research. I think we're just at the beginning of understanding all the implications of COVID-19's effect on women's lives. So with that, I will close our presentation for today. I want to thank all our presenters and look forward to further conversation. Thank you, everyone.